I'd like to call to order the City of Belton Planning Commission meeting for Tuesday, April 18. Could we have the roll call, please?
Chairman McPherson,
Here.
Mayor Larkey,
Here.
Councilmember Pryan,
Here.
Commissioner McDonough,
Here.
Commissioner Monahan Bass, Commissioner Vest, Commissioner Walton,
Here.
Commissioner Warren.
Thank you. First item that we have on our agenda tonight would be the approval of our minutes from the April 4th, 2023 Planning Commission meeting. Those have been distributed. Are there any corrections, adjustments that need to be made?
Not seeing any, I'd make a motion to approve the minutes of the April 4th, 2023 Planning Commission meeting as presented.
Thank you, Mayor.
Second.
And Councilman? All those in favor of approval of the minutes? Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you. Moving on to the next item on our agenda is the work session for the review of proposed Unified Development Code UDC text amendments related to the land use table, special use standards, uses subject to conditions, definitions, and related overlay districts. And, Director?
All right. Thanks, Chair McPherson. Wanted to give an update on the items that were pulled from the meeting at the last meeting on April 4th, and we did cancel that public hearing. And so the purpose of that was after publication of the agenda on March 31st, we did receive concerns from numerous business owners, particularly along the North Scott corridor, as to how the code changes would impact them. And so therefore, staff has delayed the full set of amendments to the land use table to allow some additional time to review those amendments and determine the impact of those amendments on existing and future businesses. What we are currently doing, though, is we are proposing to move forward with a first round of amendments to be presented to the Planning Commission on May 2nd. That first round of amendments is to expand certain land uses in additional zoning districts. And so I'll go through what those items are that will be presented at the next meeting at a public hearing, and then go through some of the other land uses where there were a number of concerns and give a little bit of an update on why we proposed those amendments, the reasons for those, the changes that were proposed, and what staff sees as the benefit of those. But again, there's no timeline on when we will be bringing any of those amendments forward or what kind of modifications we would be making to those in the future. So the first is what we're calling round one of these amendments. And these are, again, what we will bring forward on May 2nd. We've already put a public notice out for that was in the paper in the North Cass Herald last week. And these amendments will be in the agenda packet that will go out the end of next week. So with that, these amendments would be include expanding most of our public and civic uses to additional commercial and industrial zoning districts. That would include libraries, public assembly facilities, and religious assembly. Currently, most of those land uses are not allowed in any commercial or industrial zoning districts, and we have a number of our libraries in a commercial zoning district. We have a number of churches and other community facilities that are in commercial or light industrial zoning districts that we are trying to accommodate in their current location. And then we would also be expanding small retail uses to business park and light industrial zoning districts. That's any retail business that's less than 100,000 square feet. That's something that currently is not allowed in those zoning districts, and that's a rarity for Belton. Most other cities allow small retail in those zoning districts, and also in the North Scott corridor, when that plan overlay was adopted in 2017, it included the small retail uses in those zoning districts as well. So that would match what's already permitted in North Scott. For the limited manufacturing production uses, those are limited uses that are less than 10,000 square feet, where they typically they may have a retail or office component, but then in the back of the building, they may have some limited manufacturing uses, small warehouse type use that is essentially kind of operates as an accessory use to the office or retail use. So we're proposing to expand that to the general and regional commercial zoning districts, which would be C2 and C3. But they would be subject to special use permit and standards. And the standards are pretty much that they're limited to less than 10,000 square feet and that they don't pose any, they meet all the city's performance standards and they're not creating a nuisance to other businesses on the property or adjacent properties. And the reason for the special use permit is that in some areas that are zoned C2 or C3, that type of business may not be appropriate, but in other locations, the building may be better set up for that type of use. We are also proposing to add the arts and crafts manufacturing production uses as previously proposed. That's something that we went through in a couple of other previous work sessions and discussions of what that would include. So that includes a variety of arts and crafts studio, limited manufacturing production of arts and craft product. It also includes small limited beverage, food, and alcoholic beverage production. So that is something that we would bring forward. And again, those would be allowed in pretty much any commercial and industrial zoning district. So with these changes, because they are relatively minor in comparison to the entire land use table, we are not going to be making any changes to the existing code format. So originally we were bringing forward a complete repeal and replace of the definitions and all of Chapter 40. We're not doing that in this case. We'll just be amending the existing land use table and adding the arts and crafts definitions to Section 1-5. So essentially the code amendment, instead of being 85 pages, is only a 4-page ordinance. These uses would also be updated in the overall land use table for North Scott as well. So the future amendments, again, there's no timeline on these because we are reviewing these right now, and we'll bring forward some additional information on them in the future once we have a little bit more direction of where we're going to go. So what I'm going to present now are specifically related to the land use amendments that were proposed for the 4 land uses that are bullet pointed there at the bottom. So the auto-oriented uses, which includes car washes, gas stations, auto repair, auto sales, storage facilities, contractor uses, and then outdoor storage that may be in multiple formats, whether that's just standalone outdoor storage or if that's accessory to contractor uses. So first, for the auto-oriented land uses, under the current code, most of our auto-oriented land uses are permitted by right without any conditions or special use standards. Staff is proposing to convert all of those to special uses, which would require each location to be reviewed and approved subject to the standards prior to development or expansion. The reason for this is auto-oriented land uses are generally among the most intensive commercial land uses, and they often generate traffic and may not be compatible on every property that they're zoned for. So, for example, in C2 zoning, which is pretty much the entire 58 corridor and quite a bit of North Scott there, or 163rd Street, not every one of those properties may be appropriate for every type of auto-oriented uses, especially where there's immediately adjacent to it, there may be single family or some other land uses that are much lower intensity, and there's a compatibility issue there. So the solution to that would be to require a special use permit and determine if it's appropriate at that location. And if it's not entirely compatible, if there's a method of making it more compatible, whether that be additional screening or buffering or design of the facility, layout of the facility. So the benefit to the amendment and why we propose that amendment is we've received concerns from numerous citizens of the location of a number of auto-oriented businesses, and particularly when it's adjacent to single family or any kind of residential subdivision. So these amendments do help provide some level of protection and at least provide a public hearing. That's one thing we've heard, is that a number of these businesses don't require any public hearing, and so residents don't even know, didn't have a say in how those were developed or how there was screening incorporated or anything like that. So it just provides a level of protection for citizens through the public hearing process, and where there may be some additional buffering or screening or other design elements that need to be incorporated to make that use work at that location.
Hey, Matt, if I may.
Yeah.
Just related to auto-oriented uses, just to give everybody in the Planning Commission, for instance, an example of why this might be an issue. New oil change places, new tire change places. For instance, there's one going up on 58 right now, which is just down the street from a bunch of single-family housing. And some of the residents in that neighborhood have concerns over that. But because it was zoned what it was by right, they were able to go in there, and those residents had zero input on whether that was going to go there or not. And so that's the type of example that we're trying to allow for citizen feedback and involvement in how their neighborhoods are essentially shaped.
And that would be the one going in there on Apple Valley, is that correct?
Yeah, that's
Yep.
just a for instance. And so, and not that we would restrict all of those uses, but giving a special use allows for that public comment to take place.
Thank you.
So the next slide provides a little bit more detail on how this impacts businesses citywide, and then specifically how this impacts businesses on the North Scott overlay, and then how it impacts future businesses. So for each one of these land uses, we'll have a slide like this. So existing businesses that are auto-oriented are allowed to operate as approved and licensed. Any expansions to the use, whether that be the building or the site, would be required approval of a special use permit for that expansion to make the site legal conforming. For the North Scott overlay, again, the same thing. They're allowed to continue to operate as approved and licensed. They are, however, in the North Scott overlay that was adopted in 2017, the only type of auto-oriented use that can be expanded are the gas stations. All other auto-oriented uses were specifically prohibited under the North Scott overlay, so any expansion or addition would be considered redevelopment or development, which requires the property to be rezoned into the overlay at the appropriate zoning district, and then it would not be allowed to have that expansion. So that is how that works in the North Scott overlay. There is an exception if the land use is permitted in the underlying zoning district and there aren't any modifications required to the building or site to accommodate that use. So an example is if an auto repair shop is going to go into an existing garage space in a C2 zoning district that's currently outlined as part of the overlay, they could potentially go there. But under these changes that are proposed, they would still need to get a special use permit before we could issue a business license for them to operate. For future businesses, it would just be to follow what the proposed code would be, which they would have to obtain a special use permit prior to developing or redeveloping any properties. And then the special use standards that we added for auto-oriented uses were specifically intended to limit the impact to adjacent residential zoning districts and require enhanced landscaping and screening where necessary. And again, generally that's predominantly, we already have buffering requirements or screening requirements between less intensive zoning districts, but specifically if you're adjacent to residential, there may be a need for some additional buffering just based on the site design. For most of these uses, access would be limited to arterial or collector streets to limit traffic through residential neighborhoods. Again, a lot of these uses specifically generate a significant amount of traffic, and that's the purpose of adding that. Specifically for car washes, vacuum stalls be located in the side or rear of the car wash building or facility. And then for vehicle repair and vehicle sales, most of the special use standards that we had added were just carrying forward from what's already in the code. Whether there's current special use standards already in effect, or there's some conditional standards, and there's also some business licensing standards that are in the Code of Ordinances that we would carry over into the Unified Development Code. For storage land uses, under the current code, we have mini storage, which is the only storage facility that we have in the code. And those are only permitted in industrial zoning districts. So we have two, we have light and heavy industrial zoning districts. We're proposing to convert all self-storage facilities to special uses and then split them into two categories. That would be the indoor climate-controlled storage facility and then the warehouse storage facility. The indoor climate-controlled storage facility, we would expand to the business park zoning district, which is one step less intensive than the light industrial zoning district. Like the auto-oriented uses, we would be requiring the review and approval of a special use permit to ensure that that facility is appropriate at the location it's been proposed at. Our reason for that is storage facilities, particularly the warehouse format, can utilize a larger footprint of real estate, and they may also contain other external nuisances such as outdoor storage. In some locations, they may not be the highest and best land use for that location. And then introducing the indoor climate controlled to the business park zoning is more appropriate because they do tend to be designed more like an office and generally utilize less acreage per unit because they're going vertical rather than expanding horizontally. So the solution to that is, again, requiring a special use permit to ensure that the use is appropriately sited and is compatible with the adjacent uses. Another thing that we have added is limiting the amount of uncovered outdoor storage to a maximum of 50% of the outdoor storage spaces. The benefit to this is that, again, this introduces a public hearing process to allow citizens to express their concerns with any locations or designs of the land use and provide additional buffering or screening where determined necessary. How this impacts existing land uses, again, it's the same as the auto-oriented uses where you're allowed to continue to operate as approved and licensed, and then any expansion would require a special use permit approval. For North Scott, again, the same thing as the auto-oriented uses. Existing facilities can continue to operate as approved and licensed, but any additions would be prohibited under the North Scott overlay. With that being said, there is the potential opportunity under the code amendments that we proposed is introducing the indoor climate controlled facility to the business park zoning or the flex commercial industrial zoning district for North Scott. And so that does expand the opportunity for that particular type of storage facility in the corridor where it did previously not exist. For the special use standards for indoor climate controlled, we specifically prohibit outdoor storage because the intention of this is that all storage is on the interior of a building. And then it must meet the minimum design standards regardless of location. So currently we have performance and design standards for all commercial zoning districts and all industrial zoning districts, with the exception if they're more than 300 feet away from an arterial street. And there's some other reasons for that. But this would apply regardless of where they're located. Those standards would still apply. For the warehouse storage facility, which typically the way that those are designed are more of the single-story garage-style storage facilities. Any overhead garage doors would need to be screened from the street and adjacent properties. So the goal is that the storage facilities or the storage units themselves are faced internally and not externally to the property lines. The open outdoor storage, again, is limited to the maximum of 50% of the outdoor storage stalls, with the remainder being covered in some method, typically by a carport structure, and that all the outdoor storage areas also be screened from the street and adjacent properties. And all outdoor storage areas would be subject to paving, minimum paving and parking standards. For the contractor uses, currently Construction sales and services are permitted in the general commercial C2, the business park, and the industrial zoning districts. We are proposing to add a second use, which is a building or ground maintenance services. The reason for that is that we've generally interpreted those uses to be included in the construction or in the contractor land uses. However, they're not specifically called out or referenced in those definitions, and they're not called out elsewhere in the UDC. So it makes sense to treat them in the same manner as the construction, sales, and service land uses. So those include landscaping companies, exterminator companies, those types of land uses. We also would split it into with and without outdoor storage. And if there is no outdoor storage, the special use permit is not required with that. The reason for this is that the current definition of construction, sales, and services covers activities and incidental storage on lots other than the construction site. It does not indicate anything about the incidental storage and where that may be located and what all that may include. But under the North Scott overlay, the outdoor storage is specifically prohibited, except in the flex commercial industrial zoning district, including all vehicles. So the solution that we're proposing is that generally outdoor storage is incompatible in the C2 zoning district. It's predominantly a commercial service and retail zoning district. However, that doesn't mean that the contractor uses are always incompatible, just those without the outdoor storage. With those conditions, we would propose allowing cars and trucks that are serving the business to still be allowed in C2 zoning and not treat that as outdoor storage. But equipment, trailers, materials, and supplies would not be permitted outside. Those would all need to be on the inside of a building. The more intensive business park and industrial zoning districts may have additional items stored outside, and they would be subject to the screening and landscaping requirements. So the benefit to this amendment would be that we still would allow the contractor, the businesses, the ability to continue to operate, but in a manner that's compatible with the adjacent land uses and does not contribute to visual blight in the commercial corridors. In terms of how this impacts businesses citywide, it's the same as the other land uses where they're continue to operate as approved and licensed. And then any expansions would be subject to the standards. So if that's for in the C2 zoning district, they would be permitted to expand, but they couldn't expand the outdoor storage area. And then for existing businesses in North Scott, again, the contractor business itself is a permitted land use in the North Scott corridor. It's the outdoor storage that is not permitted. And so any expansions to the outdoor storage areas would not be permitted. However, we are proposing with these code amendments that we would actually be loosening the restrictions on the parking of cars and trucks for the business. That's still something that's specifically prohibited under the overlay that we think is excessive. Generally, cars and trucks that are branded with the business name do not really contribute to any issues. It's really the materials and supplies and trailers and equipment that become a bigger issue on those. So the special use standards on these, again, the no outdoor storage includes equipment and trailers, supplies and materials. However, licensed and operable cars and trucks may be parked in paved and striped parking spaces on the property. When there is outdoor storage allowed, it does require screening from the street and adjacent properties with a privacy fence or wall and landscaping. The last land use is the outdoor storage land uses. And this kind of builds a little bit off of some of what I've already talked about with the contractor land uses. But this specifically adds on the vehicle, RV, and boat storage and towing land uses. Many of those already consist of outdoor storage, but we actually don't have a specific outdoor storage yard land use that can cover other types of land uses, so we would actually be adding that land use to the code as well and defining that to distinguish it from tow lots and other outdoor storage of vehicle uses. So again, we're trying to better define these uses and when they're accessory and when they're the principal land uses. So the solution that we have for this is that generally the outdoor storage is incompatible outside of any industrial zoning districts. And particularly a number of these land uses, specifically when it is strictly just an outdoor storage yard, can become a nuisance if left without any kind of restriction on them. So we're proposing to add the vehicle and equipment storage and towing, and then an outdoor storage yard. So the outdoor storage yard may just be a storage yard where they have heavy equipment, or they may be storing materials or supplies related to an off-site business. Again, all of these particularly the outdoor storage uses, would require special use permit approval to review the location, make sure that it's appropriately zoned and it's a location that's compatible with surrounding uses, and also to address any kind of screening that's needed for those. For the impacts to existing businesses, same thing. If they're existing and they've been approved and licensed, they will continue to be able to do so. Any expansion would be subject to the special use permit approval. Again, as I mentioned, outdoor storage is not prohibited in the North Scott overlay, with the exception as accessory outdoor storage in the flex commercial industrial zoning district. Specifically though, in the North Scott overlay, new tow lots, outdoor storage yards, similar types of outdoor storage areas are not permitted. The special use standards that we have proposed on this specifically apply to the vehicle and equipment storage, tow lots, and outdoor storage yards. Would include that all outdoor storage yards be paved, and if used for parking of vehicles or equipment shall meet the minimum parking lot design standards. Gravel would not be a permitted surface for any outdoor storage areas. The area must be screened from view of the street and adjacent properties with a privacy fence or wall and landscaping. And then all vehicles and equipment that are stored on the premises shall be operable except for tow lots, which may include inoperable vehicles that are stored temporarily for up to 30 days. And some of that language is coming from elsewhere in our code, and that's specifically being added to distinguish these uses from junk or salvage yards. So that is a rundown of the code amendments that we're proposing to bring forward on May 2nd, which are, again, just that condensed list, roughly 4 pages of ordinance that would add a few land uses citywide into the North Scott corridor, and then an overview of the 4 land uses that we've heard a lot of concerns about and how those would be impacted by these changes. So happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Director. Any questions from the Council, Commission?
Can we get a copy of this?
Yeah.
I noted you'd said early on, I think it was on one of the first slides, that we have adding in the first proposal that's coming through, that there, on the public and civic slide, that there were a number of things such as religious buildings, library and all. Are those currently where they're at through special use permits? How did we get so many of them in those areas, I guess, was my question.
I think it's just one of those things where in pretty much every city that I'm aware of, those are permitted, and I think nobody thought anything of allowing those there.
We did not have a code.
And there's also, I mean, generally there's some legal cases for allowing religious assembly in those zoning districts as well. And so we just think that it's the appropriate thing to do based on the fact that those uses are there. They've not created any issues. And it's very much in keeping with every other community in the region.
Any additional questions, comments? All right, thank you, Director.
Yep.
So at our next meeting, we will be seeing the round one amendments.
Yes, that's correct.
And that will be a public hearing at that time that has been announced, correct?
That will be a public hearing,
Okay.
correct.
And then the other things will be coming at a future time to be announced.
Yes, there's no timeline on those. We'll provide additional updates as we get more information
So
of
those
how we're
come
going to
up.
proceed with that.
Very good. All right, thank you. Do we have anything further under the director's report, the development report?
Yeah, in the agenda, there was a copy of the March 2023 development report. We did issue 50 building permits last month. There were 3 new commercial building permits, including for scooters at North and Chestnut. Hillman did a second tenant finish at Building 4 at Southview Commerce Center. And then Miracle Ear is a business that's going into Cedar Tree Shopping Center.
Okay, very good. So our next meeting date is scheduled for May 2nd, and I believe that is all that we have on our agenda for this evening. Okay,
Yeah.
Mayor.
Any reason why it wasn't outlined in our council district?
No, I think it probably is just a little bit more complicated to break the permits up in that manner. We did that based on kind of the boundaries of arterial streets, so they're a little easier to track in that manner.
All right.
Motion to adjourn.
Second.
All right, we do have a motion and a second. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?